This is the Samsung Galaxy S5. Released April 2014, it's often remembered as one of, if not the, best Galaxy phones ever made. And yet, there's not that much that would separate it from the S3 and S4. The design is solid, but very much derivative. The capabilities and feature set of this phone is both overwhelming and impressive, but certainly not out of cater for this era of Samsung. But that right there is the reason this phone is so fondly remembered. Because of this era of Samsung. An era where, while their phones might have been plastic and arguably could feel cheap or less premium because of it, they also had an abundance of gimmicks and, most importantly, user choice that made their smartphones stand out from the crowd, or at least stand out from iPhone. Galaxies in the early 2010s were the best when it came to saying yes to the consumer. You want a big screen? Here you go. And here's an even larger screen with the Note series if you prefer that, stylus included. Swappable batteries, sure, why not? Heck, let's extend it to micro SD card support, and we're feeling generous, how about IP67 water resistance 2.5 years before Apple brings it to the iPhone 7? The Galaxy S5 was the culmination of Samsung saying yes to everything that struck their fancy, and it was the final Galaxy S model to host this mentality. The 2015 Galaxy S6 would completely rewrite the form and function of Galaxy phones moving forward, though Samsung would do their fair share of backtracking due to overwhelming criticism from their own customers. Some of the key features available on the S5, things like micro SD card support, swappable batteries, water resistance even, it was all gone on the S6 in favor of a sleeker, more premium build made to appeal to the more luxury-inclined smartphone user who may have previously balked at the idea of owning a plastic smartphone. The issue with the Galaxy S6, which was a gorgeous phone, really came down to timing and the rush to compromise so many of the gimmicks that made Samsung phones unique and had really become their identity. And for those users, the Galaxy S5 remained a beacon of everything the company had previously stood for and built, the best of the plastic, versatile era of early Samsung Galaxy phones. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and I don't think it's any coincidence that any list of the best Galaxy phones ever made often mention both the S5 and the S7. That S6 stands out for having left a very bitter taste in the mouth of dedicated consumers, and thus inevitably makes the phone before it, as well as the one that came after, look far better in contrast. But that doesn't downplay the simple yet complicated brilliance of the Galaxy S5, a phone that managed to somehow both do everything right, but also did far too much. So today, let's take some time to talk about one of the best phones Samsung ever made and see just how well the Galaxy S5 holds up over a decade later.
This is their final boarding call for flight 96.
There they are.
Hey,
Clustered around power outlets, near the recycling bins,
did you jiggle it?
stained carpeting, and bathrooms. Tethered to the wall,
Oh, come on.
denied the freedom to enjoy even the most basic things, like grabbing a drink, or sharing a laugh with your coworkers, or sitting with someone you know.
Says the new iPhone's coming out soon.
Hope it has a better battery.
Totally.
You're stuck here until your battery says so.
Really?
After all that time.
I gotta plug in. You come in? Actually, I'm okay.
Are you changing your battery?
Yep.
Is that the new Samsung?
Yep. Have a good one, man.
Don't be a wall hugger.
Sorry.
Get ultra power saving mode and interchangeable battery on the Samsung Galaxy S5. The next big thing is here.
Let's start this by just looking at what we have here in our hands. First thing you'll notice is the 5.1-inch Super AMOLED display. The 1080p resolution and high pixel density still look sharp, and really the best way to describe this screen is vivid. It's got that signature Samsung saturation that makes colors pop like no other phone could from this era. It's probably oversaturated if anything, but there is something really appealing about how vibrant those old Samsung AMOLED panels were, and I think they've aged quite well 10 years later. Sure, an iPhone screen from around this time doesn't look bad by any means these days, but this phone just really punches you in the face with colors, and there's no question it would have caught the eyes of customers perusing the smartphone aisle at Best Buy back in 2014. Of course, burn-in is not uncommon with these older phones, but as long as you were careful not to leave the screen on a static image too long, you should be fine. The size of 5.1 inches is also pretty small by today's standards, with relatively big bezels and a physical home button to boot. This was a phablet though, and of course, it was Samsung heading the charge for large devices. devices. Don't forget, when this came out, Apple was selling their 4-inch iPhone 5S, which feels tiny in comparison. The home button does act as a fingerprint reader, requiring a swipe rather than a simple press like Apple's Touch ID. This is a feature that I guess is nice to have, but admittedly, there was a long way to go in making it more comfortable to use. It feels really slow and a bit agonizing at times if you're not swiping it just perfectly. The one on the S6 was a huge upgrade. You do also have the navigation buttons on either side of the home button, which I've always thought was the ideal way for Androids of this era to go. If you look at phones like the first Google Pixel, which had these massive empty bezels, and then they would just waste space on the bottom of the display for navigation buttons. Samsung also had relatively slim bezels compared to a lot of phones from this time. A front-firing speaker or two would have been nice, but I do think from the front, Samsung really nailed down the form and function. Now flipping the phone to the back, things are a little more murky. Here we have a polycarbonate plastic backing that's textured with a strange dimpled pattern, intended supposedly to make this phone look a bit more premium. Maybe it helps, but the phone still feels fairly cheap in the hand, and definitely cheaper than a lot of its competition. Even aside from the glass and aluminum iPhone 5S, you had something like the HTC One M8 release around the same time, with that classic unibody aluminum frame and brushed metal backing. It's a sleek looking phone, and the S5 does seem to be a tier or two down from that kind of premium feel. I think what I really like the least about this design is the chrome painted plastic frame, made to look like metal despite very clearly being just as plastic as the rest of the phone. There's nothing necessarily wrong with a plastic device, but I would rather them just embrace it over having this pseudo-premium look that Galaxy phones of old tended to embrace. But in defense of this design, Samsung isn't Apple, and they weren't trying to create a luxury phone here. They were focused on practicality, durability, and accessibility. The plastic back was light, resistant to drops, and easy to remove, which was essential for the swappable batteries that Samsung users loved. While the build may not win many style points today, the S5 was built with purpose, and it's designed to handle a lot of abuse. It's a phone that doesn't need a case to survive day-to-day bumps, and a decade later, the back cover holds up a lot better than the cracked glass you would see on maybe a lot of S6s, for example. The weight too is noticeably far lighter than modern devices, which I can appreciate. But going beyond just the build and plastic, it's fantastic. Let's dive into some of the many quirks Samsung packed into this phone. For starters, you have that IP67 water resistance, which required this admittedly annoying little cover for the micro USB charging port. Your phone would even let you know if the cover is loose when the device is unplugged. There is also a headphone jack on the top of the phone, so we got that. But water resistance is a feature that would be gone from the Galaxy S6 for some reason, and I suppose this is the part where I mention how I very stupidly many years ago just assumed the S6 was water resistant because the S5 was, only to find out the truth the hard way. This is probably the stupidest thing I've ever done with any smartphone ever. I just had it ingrained in my mind that the S6 should be water resistant, why wouldn't it be? And yeah, okay, I'm dumb. But anyways, thankfully the S5 is water resistant, and this shot here did not kill it. And Samsung wouldn't stop there with the S5. They also crammed in a heart rate sensor right next to the camera. You could open Samsung's S Health app, put your finger on the sensor, and it would give you a readout in seconds. It was one of the first instances of a health-focused feature in a smartphone, and a gimmick that was actually kind of useful. I remember my dad using his Note 4 for the same thing, and this really was just the start of Samsung dipping their toes into what would eventually become the wearable health tech craze. And speaking of software, the Galaxy S5 came with an absolutely packed TouchWiz interface. Their custom skin on top of Android 4.4.2 KitKat with updates spanning to Android 6.01 Marshmallow. And geez, I'm not going to talk too much about TouchWiz UI because unlike this software, I would prefer this video not feel bloated. Samsung software has certainly improved over the years. This might not look that unfamiliar, but there's just so much going on here. It is so easy to feel lost. I mean, just look at this settings app. It's ridiculous. So many round icons. Tap one and then you've got another million settings to scroll through. There's too many features to speak of, and I feel like the phone is a far better experience just ignoring them. Of course, the reality here is you can't use this phone as a daily driver anymore, and I think that's pretty obvious, right? It's old, the software is completely out of date, the phone can feel quite laggy at times, it stutters, and slowdown is pretty common, particularly when you try to push the phone to do a bit more than the most basic of tasks. It did have the specs you would expect back in 2014 though. We're looking at the Snapdragon 801 chipset and 2 gigs of RAM, which I'd have to imagine made for better performance a decade ago than it does today. Of course, if you really do want to use this phone over 10 years later, you'd be best off looking at installing a custom ROM. There's plenty of them out there, and while the community has obviously dwindled in size over the years, you don't have to look too hard to find relatively recent versions of Android installable with things like Lineage OS and the like. It's impressive, but more of a fun side project than something you would ever want to actually use day to day. Turning to the camera on the back, we have a 16 megapixel sensor that, believe it or not, is capable of recording up to 4K video at 30 frames per second. Now the quality here is obviously lacking, but for a 2014 smartphone this was pretty impressive, and photos I think have also held up well enough. They're basically just what you would expect for a phone from 2014. The selfie camera is 2 megapixels, it's bad, no surprise there, but with the rear camera I do think it's possible to get some decent looking photos in the right conditions, ideally with plenty of lights, like outdoors during the day. It's not going to blow you away, but I mean, hey, it's the Galaxy S5, it's hard to ask much more than this. For storage, the phone would start at 16 gigs, but thankfully we do have that micro SD card slot, which would disappear from the S6 the next year. That micro SD card slot alone made this phone worth it over the S6 for a lot of people, and it's one of those things that really made a Galaxy phone worth choosing over an iPhone a decade ago. Features like this, and the swappable battery, and the phablet size that amounted to a phone you just couldn't get from Apple. And that's in large part much of the reason Samsung's market share skyrocketed from particularly 2012 through 2014. Phablets were on the rise, and it was Samsung really leading the charge and acting as the catalyst for the consumer shift towards these larger devices. Mind you, not everything was perfect here. The Galaxy S5 was actually underperforming Samsung's sales expectations, and by the 3-month mark it had sold 40% fewer units than they projected. June 2014 they were looking at about 12 million units sold, which was 4 million less than the S4 at the same point in time. And mind you, Apple didn't even have the iPhone 6 on the market yet, though its looming approach with plenty of rumors to go around likely didn't help with any current iPhone users who might have considered switching to Samsung otherwise. It was these lower sales that invariably led to the dramatic shift in phone design with the Galaxy S6 and S6 Edge, although even if the S5 was much more successful, I wouldn't be surprised if Samsung did it anyways. The S5, as great as this phone was also unquestionably very similar to the Galaxy S4, which was also very similar to the Galaxy S3, which was the phone that sort of established the Galaxy framework for future devices. While every generation was of course improving significantly, the design was beginning to get stale, and feature creep was only becoming more prevalent. Samsung every year just seemed to cram more and more unnecessary features that people didn't really care about into these devices. I mean, just look at that settings page, it's absurd. I think ultimately Samsung made the right move pivoting in 2015 with the S6. They just butchered the execution. The S7 would end up being exactly what an evolution from the S5 should have been, trimming a lot of the fat while retaining the core features that users loved, at least outside of the removable battery. But that's a video for another time, and for now I think I'm about ready to wind this review up. The Samsung Galaxy S5 is iconic, and from the front I really do think this phone looks gorgeous. Even if that metallic frame is actually plastic, it still does look very sleek. The screen might be too oversaturated for me, but it's memorable, and I think really this was just the culmination of everything early Samsung stood for, and that's worth something in my eyes. For as much as the software feels bloated and unnecessary, the hardware manages to more than make up for it. This phone is over a decade old, and yet so many aspects of it makes it feel so much newer, and I can't help but always feel impressed by the Samsung Galaxy S5, truly an end of an era. But yeah, hope you found this video interesting, and if you did, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more content just like this. We have a Discord, you should come join, and huge shout out to the channel members for being amazing people. Thank you guys so much, and thank you all so much for watching. I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.